Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 97, Velvet Ned. Thomas Brewerton was born in 1829 in America. He was coined Velvet Ned for his exploits, in particular for his skill in cracking safes and robbing jewellery stores and homes. He was the fifth child of 8 born to James Brewerton, an Englishman, who moved to the USA around 1826 when he was 23, and he'd married Anne Sutton, also an English-born girl, in New York in 1828 when she was 17. They had their first child before their marriage, and by 1830 they had returned to England. Thomas Brewerton married Louise Ferrer on the 12th of December 1864 at Southwark, England, at St Jude's Church of England. Thomas stated that he was a jeweller on his marriage certificate, quite ironic considering the reason he came to Australia. On his Western Australian prison record it stated Louise's maiden name as Hackney. They had a child in 1857 based on his Western Australian convict record, and the child's name was Louisa. Thomas Brewerton was a skilled lockbreaker, and he was one of the main instigators of big London robberies. He was arrested with his wife Louisa at their premises, which was being fitted up as a pie shop and a grog shop. Police reported that their furniture appeared to be new. Brewerton, a baker, then aged 27, was convicted on the 10th of April 1865 at the Central Criminal Court in London with shopbreaking and larceny. His prior convictions were taken into account and he was sentenced to 14 years transportation. The prior offences included a robbery at Portsmouth in December 1858, which resulted in a 4-year sentence, and another robbery in 1863, which earned him 9 months in jail. He was taken from Newgate Prison, where he'd served 1.5 months in separate confinement, to Pentonville Prison on the 15th of May 1865, and then on the 16th of March 1866 he was transferred to Portland Prison. He was then taken aboard the convict ship Corona for transportation on the 13th of October 1866, and he arrived in Western Australia on the 22nd of December. The record on his voyage listed him as married with 1 child and his conduct as good. In his Victorian jail record, his occupation was listed as a tailor. He was described as 5 foot 7 inches tall, with brown hair, blue eyes and a long nose, both ears pierced, a tattoo on his right arm with the letters FIAR, and a tattoo of a half moon on the outside of his lower left arm. He used the following aliases: Charles Dyson, Charles Williams, Charles Kent, Charles Brewerton, Thomas Sutton, Thomas Avery, Thomas Brewerton, and the sobriquet Velvet Ned. The first article mentioning him is in the Ballarat Star in Victoria on the 27th of June 1865, and it says the great burglaries in the city of London. The prisoners David Roberts, William Godfreys, Thomas Brewerton alias Velvet Ned, Thomas Castley alias Councillor Kelly, William Brown alias Scotty, Frederick William Wilkinson alias Carroty Fred, James Hurley, Martha Jeffries, Sarah Brewerton and Anne Castley were brought up at the Central Criminal Court to plead to several indictments charging them with being concerned in several extensive robberies in the city. Of the above prisoners, Thomas Brewerton, William Henry Jeffries, Thomas Castley, David Roberts, Louisa Brewerton, Martha Jeffries and Anne Castley were indicted with burglarously breaking and entering into the premises of Mr. John Walker, jeweller of Cornhill, and stealing watches and jewellery to the value of £6,000. After the evidence, the recorder ordered the female prisoners to be discharged from the dock, as it was proved they were all married women, and the presumption of the law was applied in their favour that they acted under the coercion of their husbands. The male prisoners were all found guilty. The facts on which their conviction took place were extremely simple. The police got information that a man of the name of Roberts, professing to be a weaver, was in possession of some stolen property. They arrested him and found a portion of it. They next made a descent upon a house in Whitechapel Road, seized a man named Jeffries and another named Brewerton, alias Velvet Ned. gold chains and jewels, £30 in notes, some sovereigns and 2 deposit receipts of the London and Westminster Bank for £400 were the plunder discovered in the premises or on the persons of the prisoners, the jewels and chains being identified as Mr. Walker's. Going next to the house of the man named Castley, alias Councillor Kelly, in Bow Road, a box was discovered containing 52 gold watches and another with £196 in gold and a £50 note. Moreover, a jemmy was found which was exactly fitting the marks on Mr. Walker's doors. The total result of the judicial inquiry into the burglary at Mr. Walker's may be thus summed up. 3 men have been convicted of the offence, some of sharing in the plunder, about a third of the property has been recovered, and one is as much in the dark as before on the question of how the deed was done. On the following day, Frederick William Wilkinson, alias Carity Fred, alias Erskine, William Brown, alias Scotty, alias Price, William Henry Godfrey, alias Barrett, alias Parker, and Thomas Brewerton, alias Velvet Ned, were indicted for burglary in the dwelling house of Francis Bennock, another, and stealing therein silk to the value of £500. 3 of the prisoners pleaded not guilty, but Jeffreys, while denying having taken part in the burglary, pleaded guilty to having received a portion of the stolen silk. Brewerton was acquitted, but the other prisoners found guilty. The prisoners convicted the previous day were then brought up for sentence. The other indictments against the men were not proceeded with, all excepting Brown had been before convicted principally of burglary, and Scotty had suffered 10 years transportation in Scotland for that offence. Brown and Jeffreys were now sentenced each to 20 years penal servitude, Castley and Brewerton to 14 years, Wilkinson and Hurley to 10 years each, and Roberts to 7 years. Robberies to the amount of between £11,000 and £12,000 had been effected by the above prisoners within a period extending a little over 6 months. And then the Sun in Sydney reported on the 12th of January 1950 a recollection of this burglary. Velvet Ned and the Jewels Safe, famous mysteries. The head of Walker's large lock-up jewellers shop at Cornhill, London, beamed gratefully at his new safe, guaranteed unopenable under 11 hours. Walker's burglar-proof shop, with its 2 doors screened by iron shutters, was on the ground floor of a 2-storey building. In the shutters were peepholes so that the policeman on his beat could look in to make sure everything was safe. Inside was a constant gas jet and an arrangement of mirrors, bringing the safe always into the focus of the peepholes. The next-door shop in the same building was a tailor's, but the wall between them was lined with iron to discourage any sly crooks who might contemplate a flank attack on Walker's gems. With that and the new safe under the eye of a policeman of at least once an hour, Walker's looked just about impregnable. Yet one fair Monday morning, in 1865, Walker's patent safe was found with its door prized open like a dead man's jaw and its £6,000 worth of gold watches, diamond rings, bracelets and cash stolen. The burglars got into the building through one of the upstairs offices. From there, they cut a hole in the floor and dropped down by rope ladder to the jewellers. But they feared the noise and mess of plaster falling on glass counters and showcases, so they dropped down instead into the tailor's. From there, they descended into the basement that ran underneath the 2 shops, and from there they bored their way up into Walker's. That detour itself must have taken a long time. Then the patent safe had to be levered open, and in flaring gaslight under police scrutiny, how had it been contrived? Well, this remained a mystery to the police until they rounded up the gang of 10 burglars. The chief of them, Velvet Ned, confessed. Velvet Ned said the first thing they did was to watch the shop to discover all the possible movements of the jeweller, his family, his friends and his servants. They shadowed them day and night for 7 weeks. Also, they knew from the beginning that to open the safe would require a good deal of hammering and wedging, and that the policeman on the beat would be bound to discover them unless they planned against it. So the first thing Velvet Ned did was to rig up in the jeweller's shop a bell that could be rung from the roof of the building. He himself took watch on the roof, listened for the policeman's footsteps, and rang the bell as they approached, so that the gang below could hear everything, could clear everything away and hide out of range of the peepholes till the bell rang again to tell them they could resume their tedious task. First, they had to sneak a fine wedge into the barely visible gap between the outer edge of the door and the side of the safe. One by one, they drove home a dozen wedges till they had enough space to thrust in a 5-foot iron crowbar, known affectionately among the practice technicians as the alderman. This gave enough leverage to open the door with the weight of 4 men hanging onto it. The job, with organised interruptions, took the whole weekend. The gang started soon after closing time Saturday afternoon and finished at 4 p.m. on the Sunday. But like most other criminals, they wasted all their cunning preliminary precautions by lapsing into a welter of childish carelessness afterwards. Within 3 weeks, they had laid such a glittering trail of gold and diamonds that the police were able to send the whole gang to jail. This created some excitement at the time because Mr. Walker brought an action against the painters of the safe. They had certified that it must take at least 11.5 hours to break it open. A statement altogether ridiculed by Velvet Ned, who when in custody declared he opened it and could open any other in less than 2 hours. These prisoners, when at Millbank, were supposed to have several thousands to their credit in various banks, but in other names. In those days, a felon's property was confiscated, and to preserve it, the greatest caution was required. So soon after arriving in Western Australia, he spent time in hospital in March 1867, suffering from a persistent ulcerated throat. He received probation on the 15th of March 1867 in Western Australia. However, he was caught stealing a crowbar, a wedge, 3 pickaxes and 2 shovels that were government property on the 22nd of February 1869. However, it was not proven. On the 5th of April 1870, he received 1 month's remission of his sentence, and he was discharged from his sentence on the 27th of August 1872. He had received his ticket of leave on the 25th of July 1872. Thomas was employed at Fremantle as a baker in September 1872 in the employ of Thomas Russell, and then he was a labourer in Fremantle in late 1872 for C. Baxter, and a warehouse man in Fremantle in June 1873 for Mr. Baxter. He was charged with working under a fictitious engagement on the 29th of September 1873 and absconded from Perth in October 1873 via Albany to Melbourne on board the Bangalore. After an absence of almost 16 months living under the pseudonym Charles Dyson, he was identified in the Melbourne court by a former Perth prison warden as Thomas Brewerton, one of the infamous Cornhill robbers. He was charged with felonious intent on the 9th of February 1874, and he received a sentence of 12 months hard labour. And the record in the Victoria Police Gazette states, Charles Dyson, alias Brewerton, alias Velvet Ned, tried in Melbourne, felonious intent, born in America, a tailor. Both ears pierced, tattooing right arm obliterated, the marks of the letters FIAR very indistinct, circle outside lower right arm, mole on the abdomen, cluster of white spots at the top of the chest. He was released by remission on the 21st of December 1874, and on the 24th of December 1874, it's announced another convict at large, the hero of the great Cornhill robbery, in court. Considerable sensation was created in the City Police Court this morning after the usual business was concluded by the appearance in the dock of a man of repellent features described on the sheet as Charles Dyson, alias Brewerton, alias Velvet Ned, charged with being a convict illegally at large in Victoria. Detective Lomax, who arrested the prisoner, applied for a remand and then proceeded to state Mr. Dyson's antecedents, which were of most sterling character. He and an accomplice in 1865 planned and carried out the most clever burglaries perpetrated in London. One of the principal performers in this nefarious transaction was Mr. Charles Dyson, better known as Velvet Ned, for his cat-like movements when engaged in this Bill Sykes business. He arrived in Perth and served some years of his sentence and at length received a ticket of leave according to the terms of which he reported himself periodically. But all at once he was missing from Albany, and an affidavit was made by one of the principals of the police force that he was supposed to have left in the mail steamer Bangalore for Melbourne, and a notice was gazetted to that effect. He was arrested here and charged with being in a public place with intent to commit a felony, and received a sentence of 12 months imprisonment, which expired this morning. But he had only been issued that when he was tapped on the shoulder and arrested by Detective Lomax on a charge of being illegally at large. Detective Upton said, "I was formerly a warder in Western Australia. I know the prisoner. He was 2 years ago the holder of a ticket of leave." The bench then asked the prisoner whether he had anything to say as to why he should not be remanded to Western Australia. And the prisoner said, "I was discharged between 3 and 5 years ago. I got a free pardon from England. They always send from Western Australia to bring back escaped people, and they have been known to do so all over the world almost." The bench said, "Then you admit you are the man described?" And the prisoner said, "Yes, but I've got a free pardon." The bench said, "That will not affect you here in any way." The prisoner said, "The captains of ships sailing from Western Australia will not take a man on board as passenger unless he has been 3 years free. They can then lead them where they choose to go, and I was told this before I left. I don't wish to stop here. Let me go on board any boat leaving this colony within 48 hours, or, if you like, until you put me on a vessel. Give me a chance. I have got money and can pay my passage anywhere." With some hesitation, the bench decided to remand the prisoner for 7 days. He was remanded in order that the bench might consider whether to send him back or sentence him to 3 years in irons under the Influx of Criminals Prevention Act. 5 days later, Velvet Ned disposed of. Dyson, one of the chief actors in the world-famed jewel robbery at Walker's shop in Cornhill in 1865, was again brought up this morning, charged with being a convict illegally at large in Victoria. Dyson seemed in the dock like a gentleman who had been summarily injured, stating that he was a free man and he wanted to know why he was arraigned. Mr. Sturt replied it was not for the interests of society that a redoubtable individual as Mr. Velvet Ned should grace Melbourne with his presence. The bench therefore thought it was better to send him back to Western Australia, where his merits would be better and more peculiarly appreciated. Mr. Dyson seemed to look upon this decision as most unjust, for he solemnly protested against it. He said, "Your worships, I've had my pardon from England and I'm a perfectly free man. If you send me away, you'll have to take the responsibility of paying my passage back." And Velvet Ned was removed to the lockup, preparatory to a journey in the direction of Fremantle. And on the 30th of January 1875, it says the notorious Charles Dyson, alias Brewster, alias Velvet Ned, was in the custody of Detective Rourke and was on board the RMS Peera, leaving Melbourne. On the 13th of February 1875, it says, while Velvet Ned was in prison in Melbourne, his photograph was taken and a copy was forwarded to the police authorities, who at once identified the likeness of Velvet Ned. Detective Rose swore an affidavit that the original of the photograph was that of our friend, with the pseudonym that he was an escaped convict from Perth, and upon that affidavit, Velvet Ned, on the expiration of his term of imprisonment, was rearrested. In due course, he was charged in the Melbourne Police Court of being illegally at large in the colony. That morning he was brought up to the City Police Court in Western Australia, being charged with absconding while on his ticket of leave. Upon perusal of the records, they were in no way favourable to the prisoner. His character was well known in this colony as a professional thief. His worship then most forcibly pointed out the absurdity and foolishness of prisoners, whether in prison or out of prison, absconding from this colony to any other part of the world, as in course of time they would be detected and brought to punishment. The police force was so organised that it was nearly an impossibility for an absconder to remain undiscovered. He sentenced the prisoner to 2 years imprisonment with hard labour, the first 12 months to be kept in irons. He did actually receive a total of 6 months of remission off his sentence. From February 1877 till June 1878, he was stationed as a baker in Fremantle by N. Brown. It was around this time that Thomas had met Honora Kent. Nora had a child, Elizabeth, and she actually changed the child's name to Rose Teresa Brewerton after the commencement of her relationship with Thomas Brewerton. In 1878, Honora gave birth to a son, Walter. She stated his father was Thomas Brewerton, despite having George Mellett, her first husband's surname, on the birth certificate. So Walter was known as Walter Mellett. Thomas became a storekeeper in Fremantle from December 1878 until June 1880. He employed a ticket of leave labourer there. Their second child, Ludoncus Albertus Mallet, known as Louis Albert Brewerton, who was born on the 19th of May 1880 in Fremantle, he's listed as illegitimate on his birth record. However, there's 2 registrations for him, and one of the registrations is for Louis Albert Brewerton, born to Nora Kent and Thomas Brewerton. Honora lists her name as Honora Kent and Honora Doyle on the records. In May 1879, his Western Australian prison record stated that if his record remained clean till August 1880, he would have his sentence remitted, which occurred, and he received a certificate of freedom on the 7th of August 1880. In March 1881, several pieces of furniture were stolen from Thomas Brewerton's Fremantle premises, and on the 1st of June 1881, he reported to the police that 28 £1 notes had been stolen from his store. This was recorded in the Police Gazette along with a proviso that the report was considered doubtful. On the 30th of September 1881, he sailed on the Macedon to Melbourne via Adelaide, leaving his family behind. Shopkeepers of Victoria were soon given notice of Brewerton's arrival there. It says it may be of interest to the mercantile community to learn that the perpetrator of the Cornhill robbery in London, which was committed 20 years ago when a jeweller's premises was broken into, is at present in Melbourne. He is a Western Australian expiree and is stated to be one of the best burglars in the world, a character not enviable, but one which makes the presence of such a man in a city like Melbourne anything but pleasant. And in the Melbourne Argus on the 1st of May 1882, arrest of 2 notorious burglars. The detective police have succeeded in arresting 2 Western Australian expirees who are suspected of being concerned in numerous extensive burglaries that were committed recently at De Graves Bond, the Mutual Store, the National Mutual Insurance Company's office and other places of business in the city and suburbs. On the night of the 26th of April, the shop of Samson Tartakova, pawnbroker, Smith Street, Collingwood, was entered by burglars by means of skeleton keys, and a large quantity of watches, jewellery, clothing and miscellaneous property was stolen. The property consisted of 38 watches of almost every kind, several chains and scarf pins, nearly 200 rings of various descriptions, gold necklets, brooches, coats, hats, trousers, overcoats, boots, underclothing, a portmanteau, several books and a great variety of miscellaneous articles, only to be found at a pawnbroker's. On the occurrence of being reported to the police, Detective O'Callaghan and Nixon were told to investigate the case, and in the course of their inquiries they learnt that 2 notorious burglars had served long sentences in Western Australia. Charles Williams, alias Brewerton, alias Dyson, alias Velvet Ned, and James Morrison, alias Pompey, were moving suspiciously about the city, and they immediately placed them under surveillance. The movements of the 2 men were very extraordinary, and it was only by means of the greatest possible exertion that the detectives were enabled to successfully carry on their operations without alarming them. The 2 detectives saw the men together in the street on Friday, when they wore genuine whiskers, beards and a moustache, and were most respectively retired, but on the following morning they appeared with clean-shaven faces, and so altered in their dress and disguised in their manner that they had not been well known, they could not possibly have been recognised. Detective O'Callaghan and Nixon accosted Williams in Wellington Street, Collingwood on Saturday morning and charged him with being concerned in the robbery at Tartakova's, but he denied it and was arrested and removed to the city lockup. Consequently, the same officer visited a small empty house in Station Street, Carlton, and found a carpet bag concealed in the oven of a kitchen fireplace, which on being opened was discovered to contain nearly the whole of the watches and jewellery stolen, and a large quantity of spurious jewellery, skeleton keys and housebreaking implements were also found in a portmanteau concealed in one of the other rooms. The detectives concealed themselves in the house, and at 5:30 o'clock yesterday morning, the back door was quietly opened from the outside by Morrison, who entered and was arrested after a somewhat exciting struggle and removed to the city lockup. The detectives succeeded in recovering the whole of the property stolen, as well as some other articles which are supposed to be the proceeds of previous robberies. The prisoner Williams was the principal in the Great Cornhill robbery, and on conviction he received a sentence of 10 years and then transported to Western Australia. During his imprisonment in that colony, he effected his escape and came to Melbourne, where shortly after his arrival he received a sentence of 12 months imprisonment for larceny. He was identified in Pentridge as the notorious Velvet Ned and sent back to Fremantle, where he was discharged in 1874 after serving his full term. He almost immediately returned to Melbourne in company with Morrison, who was described to the detectives as a Western Australian expiree who was discharged some time ago after serving 10 years for burglary. Shortly after their arrival, a number of extensive burglaries were committed, terminating with the robberies at De Grave's The Mutual Store and the National Insurance Company's office. They are supposed to have been concerned in these robberies, but as they disappeared for a while at the time, and as the property stolen consisted principally of money, no positive evidence could be obtained against them. The house where Tartakova's property was discovered was occupied by the prisoners as a retreat and was totally unfurnished. And in the Albury, Banner and Wodonga Express on the 5th of May 1882, arrest of burglars. A notorious criminal, about 45 years of age, named Charles Williams, alias Brewerton, alias Dyson, alias Velvet Ned, who is suspected of being concerned in large robberies that have been committed in Melbourne during the last few months, and also James Morrison, aged 40, who is believed to be a Western Australian expiree, have been arrested by Detective Callaghan and Nixon. Velvet Ned, as he is commonly known, is one of the smartest criminals. And on the 15th of May 1882, Brewerton received 2 years hard labour as a result of that arrest, and he was released early on the 6th of October 1883. In the Hobart newspaper The Clipper on the 16th of November 1895. This article contained a recollection of this robbery in Melbourne and how the police actually managed to capture Velvet Ned and his accomplice. Putting up a job. How detectives earn a reward. The fate of Velvet Ned. Some years ago, the public of Adelaide was startled by the news of several extensive cases of housebreaking, and the quiet city was thrown into a state of considerable alarm thereby. From the manner in which these robberies were effected, it was evident the same gang went through the lot. The premises robbed were in all cases business houses, which were left locked up at night, and the entrance was effected by climbing up a ladder onto the roof, dropping through the skylight by the aid of a rope. The iron safes containing valuables were opened by men who were evidently experts at the business and got through impossible tasks with ease. The police failed to make any arrests, and after a time all was quiet. A brief spell intervened, and then it occurred a succession of robberies of a similar character in Melbourne. Warehouse after warehouse was entered in the same fashion, when on one Sunday morning a Collins Street insurance company was broken into on the full light of noonday sun. There was much skill exhibited by the thieves in getting in and out of the said insurance office. About this time, there was an unfortunate devil knocking about the slums of Melbourne who sailed under the peculiar cognomen of Velvet Ned. He was a Western Australian expiree and associate of thieves and vagabonds. It was his glory to relate over a foaming tankard of cheap beer his powers of former days, and offered to show some of the uninitiated how to crack a kib in no kid. Indeed, there were those who held a sort of idea that he was, in reality, one of the gang so badly wanted, and this so tickled the vanity of the old convict that he never troubled himself with a contradiction. Associated with the company in the charmed circle of Ned's friends was a young person named Booge. He was an ambitious thief, a bad Tasmanian, he was born in Hobart, and was good enough for anything in the shape of putting away a mate. A conversation with Booge ended in his undertaking it with them. It pleased him to pose as a sort of tin pot hero amongst his pals, and was moreover flattered at the notice the demons took of him. Demons, you will understand, was the thieves' slang for detective officers. Booge obtained his share of the transaction on the quiet and was, of course, never arrested. Velvet Ned, though, got 7 years, his mate 5, and the receiver of the goods 6. 2 demons shared £500 between them and paid expenses jointly. Their praises were sung in every section of the press, and Melbourne was hardly big enough to hold their vanity. At last the gang of thieves were broken up, and the force was congratulated upon the acquisition to its ranks of 2 distinguished ornaments. So basically what this article was saying, by looking back, was that what we would coin today as an informant was utilised by the police in order to gain the arrest of Velvet Ned. Then in December 1885, Detective Sainsbury last evening succeeded in arresting two notorious thieves and housebreakers, George Davis, an old jailbird with several aliases, and Charles Williams, alias Velvet Ned. The two men, with two others, arrived in Sandhurst, so Bendigo, some days ago and frequented the various auction marts for the purpose of picking persons' pockets. They were yesterday detected rifling the pockets of women at Mr. G.H. Hobson's rooms and were quickly arrested. The other two managed to escape. During the past few days, several robberies and burglaries have been reported to the police, and the two prisoners were suspected. When their boxes were searched at their hotel, a large number of housebreaking instruments were found. Williams is known as the expert safe opener. And on the 22nd of December 1885 in the Mount Alexander Mail, it covers this in a little more detail. The pickpockets and burglars. The two worthies known to the police as Dapper Davis and Velvet Ned, whose career in Sandhurst was soon checked, were present at the City Court on Saturday for being in a public place with intent to commit a felony and for having implements in their possession for burglary. The evidence was very clear, and it showed that Davis was discovered at Hobbs & Co.'s auction rooms with his hand in a woman's pocket. Velvet Ned and another man were standing behind, evidently covering the movements of Davis's hand. Previously, the trio had been going about the different auction rooms in Hargrave Street and were always to be found where there was a group of women examining fowls as they were deposited outside the sale rooms. The mode at which these accomplished pickpockets carried on their operations was very clever. Immediately, a crate of fowls was brought in, a group of women gathered round to inspect them, and then the pickpockets would advance. Velvet Ned would push his way into the group and, pretending to be very eager to make a purchase, would gently elbow the woman's back upon Davis, who was supposed to take advantage of this opportunity and thrust his hands into the pockets, while the third man stood close behind, covering his movements. The numerous housebreaking implements which were found in Davis's room at the hotel, where they had been stopping, were of the most ingenious description. The masterpiece, which will open any ordinary lock with the key in it, is a very simply constructed implement, but certainly one of the most serviceable in the burglar's line. In less than half a minute, one of the doors in the police court was opened by this instrument. Each prisoner received a sentence of 2 years. Neither offender exhibited surprise on hearing the sentence passed. They maintained a callous demeanour throughout and seemed to regard the result as a foregone conclusion. Detective O'Callaghan produced a most formidable list of previous convictions against them. It was stated in evidence that after Davis was arrested, Velvet Ned went to the hotel and sustained a black coat for a white silk one. The detectives made diligent search for this white coat but were unsuccessful. After the court was over, Velvet Ned told Detective Callaghan that the white coat would be found under the front seat of a cab on which he and Constable O'Farrell had journeyed to Golden Square. The latter interviewed the cabman, and sure enough, the coat was discovered under the seat. O'Farrell watched the man closely all the time they were in the cab, hence the concealment must have been done very cleverly. Pickpocketing is not Velvet Ned's particular line. He is rather a cut above that. He's a professional thief and goes in for committing burglaries on an extensive scale. He therefore felt very much chagrined for being implicated in the present business. The criminal class have social status of their own and abhor being convicted for any offence coming within the meaning of the Vagrant Act. Ned feels this and threatened when he came out to give Detective O'Callaghan a lively time of it by robbing the town in which he happened to be then stationed from one end to the other. So Brewerton received 2 12-month sentences of hard labour that were to be served cumulatively, so intent to commit a felony, having housebreaking implements in his possession, and he was released early on the 15th of July 1887. However, on the 12th of September 1887, another article, A Notorious Criminal. On Saturday, we published a telegram from Sandhurst announcing that a notorious criminal named Charles Dyson, alias Velvet Ned, had been arrested there. He was only released from jail on the 15th of July after receiving 2 years at Sandhurst and was kept by the detective police under close surveillance until the 4th of August, when he left Melbourne for a township on the North Eastern Line. The local police were communicated with and informed of him having leaving Melbourne for the place alluded to, and his description and character also sent. Within a few days, 2 robberies were reported to the police of the township, but they did not succeed. The detective police took steps to have Dyson's route ascertained, and it was found that he travelled to New South Wales through Albury, in which he planned to stay for some days. The New South Wales police have been apprised of the character of the visitor and kept him in view. He went as far west as Junee and returned to Victoria by way of Echuca. It was at first thought that he might have been involved in the robbery at Mr. Gundy's establishment in Collins Street on Thursday night, but it was found that he was in Gornong at that time and proceeded to Sandhurst. So on the 10th of September 1887 in the Bendigo Advertiser, arrest of another criminal, the notorious Velvet Ned, taken. Yesterday, Detectives Marnie and Sainsbury were conversing with Mr. J. Hempel of the Union Bank in Hargrave Street when a familiar form passed along. Sainsbury drew Marnie's attention to the fact, and watch was immediately set upon Velvet Ned. Detective Sainsbury went to a hotel and watched, Detective Marnie also having him under notice. He was seen to enter Pascoe's hotel and again come out, apparently with a view of commencing operations, which was subsequently proved to be the case. Watching the thief, the officer saw him go down towards Bull Street, following 2 ladies, where he stopped for a moment. Seeing a woman passing along Hargrave Street in the opposite direction, he also turned and followed her. When they were nearly upon Mitchell Street, the follower brushed against her. The detectives at once inquired of the woman, Mrs. Willis of Back Creek, whether she had missed anything from her pocket, and she replied her purse was gone. Search was at once made for the thief, but he disappeared. The Reserve, Fernery, and other likely places were visited by the officers, but with no purpose. 20 minutes afterwards, the pickpocket was seen at Hargrave Street near the back entrance of the Beehive. He approached the detectives unwillingly. On account of the known desperate character of the man, Sainsbury drew his revolver and compelled him to throw up his hands. The man replied in a stupefied manner that there must be something wrong, and inquired to be told what was the matter, that a man should be thus accosted in the street. Sainsbury informed him it meant 2 years' imprisonment, as he would charge him with being in a public place with intent to commit a felony. "How could this be?" asked the man, "as I have only now come in by the Echuca train from Bagshot." He then recognised the detectives and was escorted by them to the lockup. Mrs. Willis said her purse contained 20 shillings, and 20 shillings and 7 pence was found upon the prisoner. Charles Kent is his name. His aliases are Charles Williams, Charles Brewerton, Charles Dyson, and Velvet Ned. When he was before the court in 1883, Detective O'Callaghan informed the bench the prisoner had been lagged to Western Australia for the Cornhill robbery in London. He'd received 2 years' sentence for the Tar Takeover robbery, with £1,000 worth of jewellery stolen in Melbourne in 1882. There were also other convictions against him. With such a criminal at large in this or any other place, crimes would not be uncommon, and an unbounded thanks and praise are due to the shrewdness of the capable officers mentioned, who have placed another feather in their caps. Seeing that for many years past the pick of Melbourne criminals have been taken here speaks well for the officers' energy, and it is to be hoped that the bench will place such criminals where they will not molest the law-abiding community for a very long time to come. Sergeant Marnie proved several previous convictions, and Mr. Rundle told the prisoner that his absence from the community was more desirable than his presence, and he sent him to jail for 2 years with hard labour. So he was again jailed in early 1889 and ended up only being there for a few months. He was released on the 3rd of April 1889. But then in Adelaide, South Australia, in the Evening Journal, on the 17th of May 1889, there's an article titled "Chase After a Criminal, Smart Capture." Our Murray Bridge correspondent writes, "On Tuesday night, a rather suspicious-looking character arrived here on the goods train and proceeded to the hotel. While hanging about the bar, he was questioned by Mrs. Potter, the landlady, as to his business and destination. He stated he was going to Bordertown to meet some horses, but that he might stop at the bridge for a few days. Mrs. Potter, not liking his appearance, called the attention of Constable Radigan, who at once recognised the man as the old criminal and shepherded him all night. The next morning the would-be horse dealer went to the railway station, but instead of proceeding to Bordertown, he purchased a ticket for Adelaide by the express and took his seat. On the train starting, Constable Radigan slipped into the guard's van and accompanied his man as far as Eldgate, where, fancying he was being watched, or wishing to double and obliterate his track, he got out of the train and bolted into the scrub, closely followed by Ratigan. but from the thickness of the timber and scrub he managed to get away from the constable, who gave up the chase after a long and tiresome run and proceeded towards Crafus Hotel, where he again got on the fugitive's track and ran him down at the Eagle on the Hill, where he arrested him and took him to Adelaide, where he was recognised by Detective Sergeant Upton as being one of the oldest and most dangerous criminals in the colony, known by the sobriquet of Velvet Ned, and suspected to be one of the leaders in the recent burglary at Mr. Sawtell's premises in Rundle Street. So on the 24th of June 1889, it said that after he came to Adelaide, he remained only one day when he left for Melbourne. After he reached Victoria, he was convicted of housebreaking and was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. We now find him in New South Wales. On the 30th of May 1891, in the Maitland Mercury and Hunter River General Advertiser, it says, "At the police court, 2 well-known pickpockets were sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. Alex Fleming, alias Pat Carr, alias Jack Sullivan, and Thomas Walters, alias Charles Kemp, alias Velvet Ned, were discovering pickpocketing females at the driving park races yesterday." And in the Police Gazette, it outlines in a little more detail. Alex Fleming and Thomas Walters, alias Charles Kent, alias Velvet Ned, were charged with being suspected persons found frequenting the Agricultural Society's grounds at Moore Park with intent to commit a felony and were arrested by Constables Gorman and Phelan, Sydney Police. Each sentenced to 6 months hard labour. They were further charged with attempting to steal the sum of £15 from the person of Teresa Hayes, also for attempting to steal a locket and chain at the value of £15 from May Watson, discharged and no prosecution in either of those cases. So on the 19th of February 1892 in Brisbane, Queensland, in connection with the robbery of the jewellery shop of Mr. Ruxton, watchmaker and jeweller in Ann Street Valley, 2 men were arrested at Beaudesert and were brought up on remand. Their names were Thomas Sutton, alias Dutton, alias Charles Kent, alias Charles Williams, alias Dyson, alias Brewerton, alias Doyle, alias Velvet Ned, what a mouthful, and Timothy Kelly, alias Bustle, alias Thomas, alias Blake. The accused were undefended and they conducted the case for the prosecution, the case being adjourned. 2 months later, in Brisbane, on the 29th of April, the title of the article says Heavy Sentences, Batch of Criminals. The first case called was that of Thomas Sutton with a host of aliases and Timothy Kelly, otherwise known as Robert Bustle, who'd been found guilty of breaking into the shop of R. Ruxton in Ann Street and clearing out nearly the whole of the jewellery, of which nothing of any value has been recovered. The loss is estimated to be over £400. Kelly wrote a confession. His Honour commenced to read the document and then put it away and said, "This is enough for me. It is a plea of innocence which I cannot hear. I believe the conviction is a proper one." The prisoner, that is Kelly, responded with, "Your Honour, I can prove I was absent from Brisbane at the time." His Honour said, "Silence, sir. You have had your trial and I won't hear you. I think the verdict of the jury was conclusive and I believe it to be a true one. I will hand your statement over to police to be tested by actual investigation." Sutton, alias Velvet Ned, then asked if he had any reason why the sentence should not be passed. The Crown Prosecutor said it appeared Sutton had been a criminal all his life. The police received photos of him from Pentridge, Victoria and Darlinghurst, New South Wales, where he had served 3 long sentences. Kelly was also an old offender, having been convicted in Sydney of drunkenness, indecent language and wife desertion. Addressing Sutton, His Honour said, "You are an old public offender. I think the tolerance of the public to criminals of your class is perfectly marvellous." The prisoner said, "But I am innocent." His Honour said, "Silence, sir. You have had your trial. Something different must very soon be done to deal with men of your class. Probably a time will come along when more difficult and drastic treatment will be meted out to men such as you. It will be realised, I think, that there are only 2 ways of dealing with men hardened in crime. These will either be imprisonment for life or to be deprived of life. Why the public should be harassed by supporting you for the greater portion of your life in jail, or why should they have to hear the injury of your robbing them on every possible opportunity when you're out of jail, I cannot understand." And the prisoner said, "Indeed, I am innocent, Your Honour." His Honour said sternly, "Silence, sir. How dare you say such a thing? You are telling me a base falsehood. Silence, sir, or I shall increase your sentence. You are a hardened criminal and apparently irreclaimable. You have, by your action, ruined a pair of poor old people, and you know where the things you stole from there have been planted. I shall give you an exemplary sentence, one that will keep you out of harm's way for a considerable time. If you are honest enough to make restitution and let the police know where the stolen goods are, I may consider an appeal to the executive favourably and recommend a remission of a portion of your sentence. The sentence of the court is that you undergo penal servitude for a period of 12 years. Addressing Kelly, His Honour said, "Your case, Kelly, is a different one. You are a younger man, and it may be hoped that you can be brought to see the error of your ways. You may communicate with the police and obtain a larger remission of the sentence by disclosing your plant. By your plunder, you have utterly ruined a poor old couple and deprived them of their means of support. They may never be able to recover unless you disclose where their stolen articles are. If you do, I will favourably consider your petition to the executive. The sentence of the court will be that you undergo penal servitude for 7 years." So this judge in Queensland wasn't to be reckoned with, and certainly had enough of his exploits. Velvet Ned was 63 at this point. And there wasn't anything for 3 years. However, in the Albury Banner and Wodonga Express in January 1898, there was an article titled "Stealing from the Person." At the police court on Monday, an elderly man named Thomas Avery was charged with stealing from the person of Mrs. Payne. Constable Sutherland deposed to have arrested the prisoner, who, in reply to a question, said, "I never stole the purse. I picked it up and returned it to the lady, as any honest man would do." Senior Constable Holder deposed that the purse contained 5 shillings and 10 pence and had been handed to him by the lady. Catherine Payne deposed, "On Saturday afternoon, I was at True's auction room. I was told something by a gentleman. I examined my pocket. I then found my purse, which contained silver to the value of 10 shillings, was missing. A man was pointed out to me and I called to him. I believe the prisoner was the man. He turned around and gave me the purse, which I subsequently handed to police. The prisoner declined to give evidence upon oath, but said he was innocent. He had picked up the purse. The prisoner was found to be a well-known Victorian criminal called Velvet Ned, and as a result was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labour." So this was 6 years after the court case in Brisbane. So the assumption is that he didn't do the full 12 years that was sentenced to him, and yet again he got an early release. And in April 1898, again in the Albury Banner and Wodonga Express, it says, "Velvet Ned came out of jail on Saturday, and the same day once more betook himself to the auction mark and tried to print his hand at what the artful dodger calls sly faking. He was again captured and this time got 6 months. Ned is really old enough to know better." 2 years later, in April 1900, in the Bendigo Advertiser, O'Callaghan was asked to give some reminiscences at the time of his retirement, and he said the last he heard of Velvet Ned was he was serving 10 years in Dubbo, New South Wales, and he was undoubtedly the cleverest criminal with whom I ever came into contact. Then the newspaper The Truth in Brisbane on the 29th of December 1901. "Burglars and boodlers. The work of the gang engaged at the Grace Brothers was the work of experienced men, and of a kind which pointed to a conclusion that, had they got away with the plunder, over £100 worth, police would have a high old time of effectively tracing it. The place was not for any burglar to crack, and a good deal of climbing had to be done before they got inside. 5 heavy robberies were perpetrated in Adelaide, and a great deal of plunder secured. Safes and strong rooms were playthings to them. They chopped the sides out of the great iron safes as though they were chopping open a sardine box with a tin opener. They pulled down the enormous doors of the strong rooms like matchwood. Entrance was effected in every case in the same fashion, opening a skylight and descending by means of a rope from the upper floor, where, of course, it was easily obtainable to the other parts of the premises. In one case, a warehouse in Flinders Lane, they got on the roof by means of a ladder which workmen had left, conveniently handy against the wall the night before, and only admitted their stupidity when the robbery was discovered. They got £800 in cash there, They took off their old clothes, rigged themselves out in the best they could, hats, shirts, socks, boots and everything that come handy, leaving their old clothes upon the warehouse door and turning out toffs. They were the smartest and best gang of burglars Australia has seen. And on the 13th of May 1919, stated, from Freemasons Hotel to Market Street there were only 2 cottages, but afterwards a man named Riverton, alias Velvet Ned, erected a wooden building nearly opposite Collins Street in which he carried on a grocery business. This man, some years before, whilst on ticket of leave, found his way to South Australia, where upon being recognised was arrested and repatriated to this state to pay the penalty for his offence. How he got away from Fremantle and landed in Adelaide without being detected was always a mystery, in view of the strict precautions which were taken at both places to prevent convicts from passing from one colony to another. At that time, no male person from Western Australia would have permitted to land in any of the eastern states unless he could produce a document signed by the Collector of Customs, here certifying that he was not and has never been a prisoner of the Crown. Velvet Ned always stoutly averred that he walked overland, but few believed him, as it seemed an impossible feat, although one other convict is said to have accomplished it. So, Velvet Ned's wives. We know he married Louisa Ferrer, who was charged with aiding and abetting the case of the London robbery on the 18th of April 1865 that Thomas was convicted for. And we do know that Louisa, as well as the other 2 wives, Martha Jeffries and Anne Castley, were acquitted, despite having actively assisted in hiding and disposing the stolen goods, for the reason that they were married women and under the theory that they were pressured into being involved by their husbands. Louisa died in London in July 1905, aged 66. Louisa and Thomas's daughter, Louisa Ann Brewerton, was born in 1859 in Middlesex. She married John Alexander Gaylor in August 1888 in England. In 1911, in the census, John was listed as a carpenter and joiner, and Louisa was a fancy box maker, and they lived at South East Hackney, and they had 3 children. Now, another one that has been rumoured to be Thomas Brewerton's wife is Honora Kent. Honora was born on the 23rd of August 1859 in Dublin. She was the daughter of Thomas Kent and Hannah McMullen. Her father died when she was an infant, and Honora was in the Poor Law and Board of Guardian records as being admitted aged 4 on the 1st of June 1863 in South Dublin. She was discharged by the 2nd of September of that year, possibly because her mother married Joannis Doyle in March 1865, and Honora was known to have taken on her stepfather's surname. After her second husband's death, Hannah McMullen emigrated to Western Australia with her 3 children by 1867. Honora married George Mellett in Geraldton on the 4th of January 1876 when she was 17, and she had a daughter, Elizabeth Mellett, born on the 20th of September 1876 in Geraldton, Western Australia. It then states that Nora met convict Thomas Brewerton in about 1877 and moves in with him, takes on his name, and also gives her daughter Elizabeth the name Rose Teresa Brewerton. Honora had a son Walter in 1878, and the records state his father is Thomas Brewerton, despite having George Mellett's surname on the birth record due to Honora still being married to Mellett. Home life must have been difficult for these children. From an early age, Walter Merritt freely roamed the bush around Fremantle, at times staying out all night from the age of 6. And in 1887, there was a record mentioning Walter Mellett. Walter Mellett, a child of 9 years of age, was charged with vagrancy. The boy stated that his father, a carpenter, had run away some time ago and his mother died last week. Mr. Leake said, "No, I know better than that. The mother, Nora Doyle, is a prostitute at Fremantle, and the father, Velvet Ned, once an imperial prisoner, is now doing time in Victoria." After consulting his colleagues, Mr. Leake said, "Well, my boy, we must go through the farce of sentencing you to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labour as a rogue and a vagabond. Mr. Dale will no doubt take care of you until we hear from the governor, to whom your case will be reported, as to what is to be done with you. No doubt you will be sent to Rottnest, where you will be kindly treated and taught a trade." So, as Mr. Leake said, young Walter Brewerton spent some years at the Rottnest Reformatory. In 1914, he was employed at Moira, and he faced a charge of rape, which was dismissed in court. Many years earlier in 1899, Walter had been a witness at the trial of his mother's former partner, Hartley Bowen, who was accused of setting fire to their house at Mount Magnet, killing Walter's aunt Catherine and her 2 children. Catherine was Honora's sister. Despite compelling evidence to the contrary, Hartley Bowen was found not guilty of the crime. At the trial, Nora stated she did not know the whereabouts of her husband, George Mallet. Hartley Bowen's full name was John Hartley Bowen. He was actually known by the name Deadwood Dick, and there's so much that relates to his story that I've actually created a bonus episode on him. Nora was charged with having no visible means of support on the 29th of August 1887 in Fremantle, and in September 1887 she was recorded as being a known prostitute in Perth. On the 1st of May 1889 she was fined for using obscene language in Fremantle. So Honora died in 1903 in Kew, Western Australia under the name Honora Scorer. Family trees have her married to Henry Scorer, an Englishman who was a carpenter who lived at Kew and was 2 years older than Honora. Honora's daughter, Elizabeth Mallet, she also was a ward of the state. She was at a Roman Catholic orphanage between July 1881 and 1891. And as mentioned, after Honora started her relationship with Thomas Brewerton, she changed Elizabeth's name to Rose Teresa Brewerton. So the records state in Western Australia that she married Matthias Andreas Holst on the 8th of February 1897 in New Norcia, Western Australia. They lived at Morra in South Australia in 1917, and Elizabeth died on the 16th of September 1927 in Perth, aged 50, and her and Matthias had 7 children. Now, Thomas and Honora had a son, Ludonkus Albertus Mallet, known as Louis Albert Brewerton, and he was born on the 19th of May 1880 in Fremantle. He was listed as illegitimate on his birth record, and Honora lists her name as Honoria Kent and then Honoria Doyle. There are actually 2 birth registrations for him. Louis Albert Kent, born on the 19th of May 1880, and registered to Nora and Thomas Kent at Fremantle, and then a Louis Albert Brewerton, born to Nora Kent and Thomas Brewerton. It is likely that Ludonkus was taken to the New Norcia mission. Lewis married Honora Murphy on the 16th of April 1913 in New Norcia, Western Australia. He enlisted as Louis Albert Brewerton in the First World War on the 16th of July 1917. He listed his mother, Nora Brewerton of New Norcia, Western Australia, as his next of kin. He was a farmer at the time of his enlistment, and he was discharged on the 18th of October 1917 due to an underlying health condition, and he did not fight overseas. Lewis was the manager of New Norcia Estate, and he died on the 12th of July 1944 in Goomalling, Western Australia. An article outlining his death in the 2J Herald in Western Australia. Death of Mr. Louis Albert Brewerton. Deep regret was felt by a wide circle of friends when it became known that Mr. Louis Albert Brewerton had passed away at Goomalling Hospital early on Wednesday, aged 65. To his widow and only son Pat, every sympathy is extended in their time of sorrow. Born at Fremantle, he took up farming at York and Bruce Rock and was at one time the farm manager for the New Norcia Mission. Coming to Goomalling in March 1920, he engaged in farming on the property several miles north of town. During the 24 years spent in the district, the late gentleman has associated himself with many movements calculated to better the town and district. For one term, he served on the road board as Central Ward member. One who could be described as a good living man, the late gentleman was a staunch churchgoer of the Roman Catholic faith, and with his passing, his church loses one of its strongest supporters and the district of a respected resident. Considering that he had a career criminal as a father and a prostitute as a mother, he really made well for himself. So as mentioned, they had one son, Patrick. Patrick Pius Louis Benedict Brewerton was born at Kalingari, Western Australia in 1914. He married Mary Olive Anderson at York on the 22nd of January 1947. Pat Brewerton was musical. He played violin and saxophone around Goomallang in a band during the 1940s. And he died at sea on the way to New Zealand on the 15th of January 1963, aged only 48. They had 2 daughters, Margaret and Barbara. And there is an article outlining his death. It says, Pat Brewerton dies on New Zealand cruise. Residents of Goomaling were shocked to learn of the sudden death on the 15th of January at sea of Mr. Patrick Brewerton, an old and highly respected resident of the district. At the time of his death, Mr. Brewerton and his wife were on a cruise to New Zealand. The late Pat Brewerton spent practically the whole of his life at Goomaling. Throughout his life, he played a prominent part in the social life of Goomaling. Keenly interested in music, he was for many years a member of local orchestras which supplied music for district dances. He had been associated with the Goomaling cinema for a quarter of a century. He was a devout Catholic and was a great worker for his church. Until a few years ago, when a heart complaint forced him to give up heavy work, he farmed the family property on the outskirts of Goomaling town site. Since then, he's lived in semi-retirement in town. He retained an interest in the farm by tending to the stock which he continued to run on the property. So you may have noticed that I have not given you a definitive date of death for Velvet Ned. There are mentions of him dying in Pentridge. However, his Victorian record does not state that there was a death in jail, and there would have been an inquest if that was the case. So, unfortunately, it ends with a mystery, but a very, very interesting tale of Velvet Ned.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.